The Montana Territory is stretched before Nathan Hargrove like a vast question mark, endless in its possibilities but equally boundless in its ability to break a man. The late autumn wind carried the promise of a harsh winter, a fitting backdrop for a life that had grown increasingly cold. Standing before the weather-beaten general store, Nathan clutched the deed in his calloused hand, the price still burning in his mind like a cruel joke. $99. The sum might as well have been pennies tossed into a wishing well for all the hope it offered. Buildings in decent condition didn't sell for the price of a month's groceries, especially not in a town where land supposedly held value. Yet here he stood, owner of this forlorn structure, its windows clouded with decades of dust and neglect. The territorial clerk who'd handled the auction kept giving him odd glances, as if Nathan had purchased not just a building, but a curse. Mighty strange about the Blackwood place, the clerk had muttered while processing the paperwork. Victor seemed mighty surprised by the tax sale. Always thought the family had arrangements for such things. But bureaucracy didn't care about family arrangements or broken trust. The ink was dry, the transaction complete. This forgotten corner of Montana belonged to Nathan Hargrove now, for whatever that was worth. At 45, Nathan's face had begun collecting the lines of disappointment. The creases around his eyes weren't from laughter, but from squinting at fine print, hunting for the truth buried in records and testimonies. Once a respected investigative journalist in Chicago, he'd been discredited after publishing an expose on political corruption that powerful men ensured could never be proven. His sources vanished, evidence disappeared, and his reputation crumbled like aged parchment. The divorce papers arrived 3 months later. His wife couldn't bear the shame or the sudden financial freefall. Their modest savings disappeared into legal fees and alimony, leaving Nathan with little more than his carpentry skills from his youth and a stubborn refusal to admit defeat. This abandoned general store represented his last grasp at redemption before heading back east, tail between his legs. He'd used nearly the last of his money to come west, hoping the frontier might offer second chances. Instead, it had offered him this, a dilapidated building that smelled of dust and broken dreams. Nathan pushed open the front door, wincing at the plaintive cry of rusted hinges. Shafts of afternoon sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like ghostly messengers from the past. The wooden floors, warped by time and neglect, creaked beneath his weight as if protesting this intrusion after years of solitude. Empty shelves lined the walls, their surfaces dulled by a thick layer of grime. A counter with a rusted cash register stood at the far end, silent testimony to transactions long forgotten. Everything appeared exactly as one would expect from a place abandoned to time and elements, a perfect monument to failure. Everything except for one detail that made no sense at all. A door stood at the back of the store. Unlike the weathered wood that comprised the rest of the building, this door was solid oak, its surface unmarred by the passage of years. It looked newer somehow, yet was covered in the same layer of dust as everything else. The brass handle gleamed dully in the fading light, almost beckoning. Nathan approached it with the instinctive caution that had once made him an excellent journalist. Something about this door felt wrong, out of place in this tableau of abandonment. He reached for the handle, expecting it to turn easily. It wouldn't budge. Not broken, not rusted shut, locked. The territorial clerk had assured him that every key had been accounted for in the bundle now jangling against Nathan's thigh. Every door, every cabinet, every nook of the place is yours now, Mr. Hargrove, he'd said with an odd emphasis, as if trying to convince himself as much as Nathan. So why was there a door that none of his keys could open? Nathan ran his fingers along the edges, searching for any hidden mechanism or groove that might explain its stubbornness. The wood felt solid beneath his touch, smooth in places, rough in others where age had exacted its toll. But there was nothing to explain why it wouldn't open. No visible keyhole, no obvious locking mechanism, not even hinges on this side. He stepped back, studying the door from different angles. It stood there like a challenge, mocking his ownership of this forsaken place. Every other aspect of the building belonged to him now, every creaking board and dusty corner. But this one door remained a mystery, a secret someone had gone to great lengths to keep sealed. A soft knock on the front entrance startled him from his examination. Through the grimy windows, he could see a woman's silhouette against the bright exterior. She wore a simple dress, her silver hair pulled back in a practical style that suggested a life of hard work and practical solutions. When he opened the door, she offered a cautious smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be the new owner," she said, her voice carrying the kind of careful politeness people used when they weren't sure how to feel about someone. "I'm Margaret Winters. I run the boarding house across the street." Margaret was well into her 70s, her face a map of fine lines that spoke of both laughter and hardship. Her eyes, however, remained sharp and observant, missing nothing as they swept over Nathan and then past him to scan the interior of the store. "Nathan Hargrove," he replied, extending his hand. "Just arrived from Chicago." "Long way to come for a building most folks avoid," Margaret said, her handshake surprisingly firm. "Been a long time since anyone set foot inside this place. Most around here figured it would stay empty forever." Nathan's journalist instincts prickled at her words. "Why is that?" Margaret hesitated, her gaze settling on something behind him. Nathan turned, following her line of sight directly to the mysterious door. "That building has quite a history," she finally said, choosing her words with deliberate care. "Not all of it pleasant. The man who sold it to you, Victor Blackwood, he inherited it from his father, but he never wanted anything to do with the place. Spent years trying to find someone willing to take it off his hands. For $99, I can understand why he had trouble," Nathan said, trying to keep his tone light. Margaret's expression grew more serious, aging her face by another decade. "The price wasn't the problem," she said quietly. "The Blackwood family has secrets they'll do anything to protect. And now that they've lost control of this building, they'll be desperate to get it back." Before Nathan could ask what she meant, Margaret's attention shifted fully to the back of the store. Her face went pale, and she took a small step backward. "That door," she whispered. "It's still there." The way she said it made Nathan's skin crawl, not surprise, but something closer to dread, as if she'd been hoping against hope that the door might have somehow disappeared in the years since she'd last seen it. "You know about it?" he asked. Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the mysterious barrier. "Everyone in town knows about that door. What we don't know is what's behind it." Her voice dropped even lower. "And after what happened to the last person who tried to find out, maybe that's for the best." Nathan felt his pulse quicken. "What happened to the last person?" Margaret wrapped her arms around herself despite the warmth of the afternoon. "James Miller. He was a carpenter, worked on buildings all over town. About 10 years ago, he got curious about this place. Started asking questions, poking around. Said he was going to figure out how to open that door." She moved closer to the window, peering out at the street as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "James was a good man, methodical. If anyone could have solved the puzzle of that door, it would have been him. He spent weeks studying it, bringing tools, trying different approaches." "And," Nathan prompted when she fell silent, "one morning his wife found him in his workshop, dead. No signs of violence, no indication of what killed him. The doctor said his heart just stopped, but James was only 35 years old, strong as an ox." Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The strange thing was, all his notes about this place were gone. Every sketch, every measurement he'd taken. Someone had cleaned out everything related to that door. Nathan glanced back at the mysterious barrier, feeling a chill despite himself. Maybe someone didn't want him finding out what was behind it. "That's what a lot of people think," Margaret agreed. "But who? And why go to such lengths to keep a door closed?" The question hung in the air between them. Nathan found himself drawn back toward the door, studying it with new eyes. Someone had killed to protect whatever secret lay beyond that threshold. The thought should have terrified him, should have made him want to pack up and leave immediately. Instead, it only made him more determined to uncover the truth. His journalistic instincts, dormant since his disgrace in Chicago, flared to life like embers in a forgotten fire. "There has to be another way to access whatever's back there," he said, more to himself than to Margaret. "Maybe from outside or through an adjacent building." Margaret shook her head. James thought the same thing. He checked every angle, measured the building from all sides. That room, whatever it is, can only be reached through that door. She gestured helplessly at the solid barrier. "And that door, well, you've seen for yourself. Nathan walked to the door again, pressing his ear against the wood. Was that his imagination, or could he hear something on the other side? A faint sound, almost like breathing. But that was impossible. The building had been locked up for years. Nothing could be alive back there. "Have you ever heard anything from behind it?" he asked Margaret. Her reaction was immediate and telling. She went rigid, her face draining of what little color remained. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I thought I heard—" Nathan paused, realizing how crazy it would sound. "Never mind." But Margaret was already backing toward the front door. "You heard something, didn't you? That's how it starts. First you hear the sounds, then you start having the dreams, then you become obsessed." Her voice rose slightly, just like James did. She was at the door now, her hand on the handle. "Take my advice, Mr. Hargrove. Whatever you paid for this place, it wasn't worth it. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." With that, she was gone, leaving Nathan alone with the mysterious door and the growing certainty that he'd bought far more than just an empty store. He'd bought himself a dangerous mystery, one that had already claimed at least one life. The truth was becoming clear. James Miller hadn't died of natural causes. Someone had killed him to stop his investigation. And now Nathan was walking the same dangerous path. But as he stood there in the gathering shadows of late afternoon, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. Whatever was behind that door had been hidden for decades, protected by people willing to commit murder. And despite every instinct warning him of the danger, Nathan was going to uncover the truth that had cost James Miller his life. The shadows lengthened as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Nathan finally locked up the store and made his way to Margaret's boarding house, the only establishment in town with a vacancy sign. Despite her warnings, or perhaps because of them, she didn't seem surprised to see him at her door. "One night or longer?" she asked, her manner professional now, the earlier vulnerability carefully tucked away. "I'm not sure yet," Nathan answered honestly. "Depends on how long it takes to make that building habitable." Something flickered across Margaret's face, concern perhaps, or resignation. "Room at the top of the stairs is yours. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6. $5 a week, paid in advance." As Nathan settled into the sparse but clean room, he couldn't shake the image of that door from his mind. He'd spent his career looking for stories hidden behind locked doors, literal and figurative. This time the door was real enough, but what story did it conceal? Morning found him at the town records office, a cramped building that smelled of old paper and dust. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked surprised when Nathan asked about the Miller death 10 years prior. "Not many people ask about that case anymore," the clerk said, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "Terrible thing. James was well liked around here. His death shook the whole community." Nathan waited while the man retrieved a file from the back room. The official report was brief and unsatisfying. James Miller, age 35, found dead in his workshop by his wife Martha. Cause of death listed as sudden cardiac arrest. No signs of foul play. Case closed. "And was there an investigation?" Nathan asked. The clerk shrugged. "Sheriff looked into it, but what was there to investigate?" Man's heart stopped. "Happens sometimes, even to young folks." Doctor said it could have been a condition James never knew he had. But as Nathan read through the report, something caught his attention. The date of James's death was exactly 3 days after he'd made his final visit to the store. 3 days after he'd spent an entire afternoon examining that door, according to witness accounts from neighbors who'd seen him there. "Did anyone ever ask what James was working on before he died?" Nathan pressed. The clerk's expression grew uncomfortable. His wife mentioned he'd been obsessed with some old building project, said he was staying up nights drawing diagrams, talking about solving some kind of puzzle. But after he died, she destroyed all his work, said she didn't want any reminders. Nathan left the records office with more questions than answers. He spent the rest of the morning walking through town, asking subtle questions about the Blackwood family and their property. Most people seemed reluctant to discuss the subject, offering vague responses and changing the topic quickly. It was past noon when he finally found someone willing to talk. An elderly man named Harold Jenkins, who ran the town's small hardware store, had known the Blackwood family for decades. "Old Edmund Blackwood was a strange one," Harold said, leaning against his counter. "Built that store back in the 1870s, but it was never quite right. kept making modifications, adding walls, changing the layout. Folks thought he was just particular about his business setup. What kind of business did he run? Nathan asked. General store mostly, but Edmund was secretive about certain areas of the building. Had rooms in the back that customers weren't allowed to enter. Said it was for storage, but deliveries always came through the front. Harold paused, studying Nathan carefully. You're the one who bought the place, aren't you? When Nathan nodded, Harold's expression grew serious. Edmund died about 15 years ago. Heart attack, just like James Miller. Difference was Edmund was in his 70s, so nobody questioned it. But his son, Victor, he never wanted anything to do with that building. Wouldn't even step foot inside after his father's funeral. Why not? Harold glanced around his empty store, then leaned closer. Because Victor knew what his father had been hiding back there, and he knew that some secrets are dangerous enough to kill for. The old man straightened up suddenly, his face closing off as the bell above his door chimed. A woman had entered, and Harold's demeanor changed instantly. Afternoon, Mrs. Blackwood, he said stiffly. Nathan turned to see a middle-aged woman with sharp features and cold eyes. She looked him up and down with obvious displeasure. So you're the opportunist who bought our family's property at that auction, she said, her voice carrying a clear threat. I'd suggest you reconsider your investment. That building has a way of bringing misfortune to those who don't respect its history. Before Nathan could respond, she was gone, leaving him with the unsettling realization that the Blackwood family was still very much interested in keeping their secrets buried. Nathan returned to his store that afternoon with a crowbar and a sledgehammer borrowed from Harold's hardware shop. If the Blackwood family was so desperate to keep people away from that door, then whatever lay behind it was worth discovering. Their threats only strengthened his resolve. He spent an hour examining the door more carefully than before, using a lantern to illuminate every detail. The wood was indeed different from the rest of the building, darker and denser. When he tapped it with the hammer, it produced a solid thunk that suggested the barrier was several inches thick. But it was what he found at the base of the door that made his pulse quicken. Scratches in the wooden floor, barely visible under decades of dust. Someone had tried to pry the door open from the bottom, gouging deep marks into the boards with tools similar to his own. James Miller's tools, most likely. The carpenter had been closer to opening this door than anyone realized. Following the scratches, Nathan discovered that one of the floorboards near the door was loose. When he worked his crowbar under it, the board came up easily, revealing a small space beneath. Hidden in that gap was a folded piece of paper, yellow with age but still legible. James's handwriting was precise and careful, the work of a man accustomed to detailed measurements and exact specifications. But the words themselves revealed growing desperation and fear. Day 12 of investigation, the door mechanism is unlike anything I've seen. No hinges, no handle, but there are pressure points in the wood that suggest a locking system built into the structure itself. Found evidence of similar construction techniques in books about prison architecture from the eastern states. Someone designed this door not just to keep people out, but to ensure that whatever is inside could never escape. Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. Never escape. What could possibly require that level of containment? He continued reading. Spoke with Edmund Blackwood's former assistant today. Man was terrified. Wouldn't give his name, but he confirmed what I suspected. There are things hidden in that room that Edmund never intended anyone to find. Documents, evidence of business dealings that could destroy several prominent families in town. The assistant said Edmund used to call it his insurance policy. The final entry was dated just 2 days before James's death. I think I know how to open the door. The pressure points have to be activated in sequence, but it requires 2 people working simultaneously. I've asked Martha to help me tomorrow night. We're going to finally see what Edmund Blackwood was so desperate to hide. But James had died before that attempt could be made, and now Nathan understood why all of James's notes had disappeared. Someone had known about his plan and made sure he never got the chance to execute it. A sound from the front of the store made him look up from the note. Footsteps on the wooden floor. Slow and deliberate. Someone had entered while he was absorbed in James's discoveries. I was hoping you'd be reasonable, came a man's voice from the shadows near the entrance. Nathan recognized it immediately. Victor Blackwood had returned. But I can see you're just as foolishly persistent as that carpenter was, Victor continued, stepping into the light. He was no longer the nervous, eager-to-sell man Nathan had met at the auction. His posture was confident now, his eyes cold and calculating. James Miller was warned to stay away from this place. He ignored that warning, and it cost him his life. Victor moved closer, and Nathan could see he wasn't alone. Two other men flanked him, both large enough to handle any resistance Nathan might offer. "I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 for this property," Victor said. "That's more than 50 times what you paid at that auction. Enough money to buy yourself a much better business in a safer location." Nathan folded James's note and slipped it into his pocket. "And if I refuse?" Victor's smile was neither warm nor reassuring. "Then you'll learn why James Miller's heart stopped beating. And this time there won't be anyone left to ask inconvenient questions about what happened." The two men moved closer, and Nathan realized he was trapped between them and the mysterious door. Whatever secrets the Blackwoods were protecting, they were willing to kill to keep them hidden. But surrender wasn't an option now. He'd come too far and learned too much to simply walk away. The question was whether he could survive long enough to unlock the truth that had already cost one man his life. Nathan gripped the crowbar tighter, his mind racing through possible escape routes. The front door was blocked by Victor and his men, and the back of the store offered no exits except for that mysterious locked room. He was trapped. But James Miller's note had given him one crucial piece of information that might save his life. "Before you do something you'll regret," Nathan said, keeping his voice steady. "You should know that I've already shared what I found with someone else. If anything happens to me, the whole town will know about your father's insurance policy." It was a bluff, but Victor's reaction told him it had hit its mark. The man's confident facade cracked slightly, revealing the desperation underneath. "You're lying," Victor said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "James Miller wrote detailed notes about his investigation. Notes that your people missed when they cleaned out his workshop." Nathan pulled the yellowed paper from his pocket, holding it where they could see it. "He documented everything. Your father's blackmail scheme, the families he was extorting, the evidence he kept locked in that room." One of Victor's companions shifted nervously. "Boss, if word gets out about the old business arrangements—" "Shut up," Victor snapped. But the damage was done. Nathan now knew for certain that multiple people were involved in whatever conspiracy Edmund Blackwood had orchestrated. "Here's my counteroffer," Nathan continued. "You tell me exactly what's behind that door, and I'll consider keeping your family secrets buried. But if you try to silence me the way you silenced James, those notes go straight to the territorial marshal." Victor stared at him for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he gestured for his men to step back. "You have no idea what you're meddling with. My father wasn't just collecting evidence for blackmail. He was protecting this town from information that could destroy innocent people along with the guilty." "What kind of information?" "The kind that proves half the prominent families in this territory built their fortunes on fraud, theft, and murder." Victor's voice was bitter. "Land grabs from native families, forged mining claims, murdered competitors. My father documented it all because he was involved in arranging most of it." Nathan felt his stomach turn. He was organizing criminal conspiracies? He was the middleman, the go-between who helped respectable men do disreputable things without getting their hands dirty. And when some of them got nervous about loose ends, my father made sure he had enough evidence to keep himself alive. Victor looked toward the mysterious door with obvious hatred. "That room contains enough documentation to send dozens of people to prison or the gallows, including members of my own family." "Then why not destroy it all?" "Because we can't open the door any more than you can." Victor's admission came through gritted teeth. "My father designed the locking mechanism himself, and he died before telling anyone how it worked. James Miller came closest to figuring it out, but we had to stop him before he could expose everything." Nathan absorbed this revelation. "So you killed him to protect criminals?" "We killed him to protect the entire social structure of this territory," Victor said defensively. "Do you have any idea what would happen if all those crimes came to light? The chaos, the violence, the innocent people who would suffer when their families' reputations were destroyed." Victor stepped closer. James Miller was a good man, but he was naive. He thought truth and justice were more important than stability and peace. The confession hung in the air between them. Victor had just admitted to murder, but he seemed to believe he was justified in his actions. The corruption ran deeper than Nathan had imagined, involving not just individuals, but an entire network of conspirators who saw themselves as protectors of the status quo. "Before I dispose of you," Victor said coldly, "I need to know exactly what my father left behind. How much evidence exists? Who else is implicated? What specific crimes are documented? I've been operating blind for 15 years, and that ends today." Nathan realized this was his only chance. "Then you'll have to help me open it." James's note said it requires two people. "You're not in a position to make demands," Victor replied, but his eyes showed conflict. The unknown was eating at him. "Actually, I am," Nathan countered, "because I've already told Margaret Winters about James's murder. If I don't return to her boarding house by sundown, she has instructions to contact the federal marshal in the territorial capital." It was a desperate bluff, but Victor's reaction showed it had impact. He couldn't afford to take chances with federal involvement. "I know how to open the door," Nathan continued, "and once we're both looking at what's inside, you'll have the information you need to protect yourself. But kill me now and you'll face federal investigation while still being blind to the evidence." Victor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You're bluffing. If you knew how to open that door, you would have done it already." James figured out the mechanism, but he needed help to activate it. Two people working simultaneously on different pressure points. Nathan moved toward the door, keeping the crowbar ready. "The question is whether you want to see what your father left behind, or whether you'd rather spend the rest of your life wondering if someone else might figure out the secret." The threat was implicit but clear. Nathan was offering Victor a chance to control the situation rather than leave it to chance. It was a gamble, but the older man's expression suggested it was working. "Even if we open it, what makes you think I'll let you live to tell anyone what we find?" Victor asked. "Because once that door is open, we'll both know exactly what we're dealing with," Nathan replied. "And you'll realize that killing me here that would bring the kind of attention you can't afford." Victor nodded to his men, who moved back toward the front of the store, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough away to give them working space. "Tell me what you need me to do," Victor said reluctantly. Nathan examined the door again, this time with James's notes fresh in his mind. The carpenter had identified specific areas where the wood grain was different, subtle variations that suggested hidden mechanisms underneath. Following the directions, Nathan found the first pressure point about 3 feet up from the floor on the left side. "There's another one over here," he told Victor, indicating a spot on the right side at the same height. James's notes say we have to press both points simultaneously and hold them for exactly 10 seconds. Victor moved into position, his face grim. "If this is some kind of trick." "It's not a trick, it's justice, Moines." Nathan placed his hand over the designated spot. "James Miller died trying to expose the truth. The least we can do is finish what he started." They pressed their respective points together. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Nathan heard a faint clicking sound from within the door, followed by what sounded like gears turning. The mechanism was old, but still functional, engineered to last decades without maintenance. After exactly 10 seconds, there was a final click, and the door swung inward on silent hinges. The smell hit them first, not decay or death, but the musty odor of papers that had been sealed away from air and light for years. Nathan stepped forward, holding his lantern high to illuminate the space beyond. The room was smaller than he'd expected, perhaps 8 feet square. The walls were lined with wooden filing cabinets, each drawer carefully labeled with names and dates. In the center stood a desk covered with ledgers, maps, and what appeared to be legal documents. But it was the far wall that made both men stop and stare. Photographs, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows like a gallery of evidence. Images of meetings, handshakes, and document signings that showed prominent citizens engaged in activities they clearly never intended to have recorded. Below each photograph was a small placard with names, dates, and brief descriptions of the crimes being committed. "My God," Victor whispered. "He documented everything." Nathan moved closer to examine the photographs. Land seizures, forged contracts, intimidation of witnesses, and worse. Edmund Blackwood hadn't just been a middleman in these crimes. He'd been a methodical blackmailer who had turned documentation into an art form. But it was the final photograph that made Nathan's blood run cold. It showed a younger Victor Blackwood standing over a man's body, a shovel in his hands, and fresh earth nearby. The placard read simply, James Miller, October 15th. Problem solved. Victor had lied about James's death. The carpenter hadn't died of a heart attack in his workshop. He'd been murdered and buried. And Edmund Blackwood had somehow managed to photograph the crime before his own death, which meant that Edmund had known his son was planning to kill James Miller, and he'd made sure there would be evidence of that murder sealed away in this room, waiting for someone brave enough to discover it. You're looking at your own death warrant, Nathan said quietly, holding the photograph where Victor could see it. But when he turned around, Victor was smiling, and the gun in his hand was pointed directly at Nathan's chest. Nathan stared at the gun barrel, his mind racing. You can't kill me here. Not with all this evidence surrounding us. It would be too obvious. Actually, it would be perfect, Victor said calmly. A curious new owner breaks into a sealed room, accidentally triggers some kind of old security mechanism, and dies in the process. These old buildings can be dangerous places, especially when people don't respect their history. But even as Victor spoke, his eyes kept darting to the photograph that showed him burying James Miller. The evidence of his father's betrayal was clearly eating at him. Your father knew you were going to kill James, Nathan pressed. He set up this whole room as insurance against you, didn't he? He never trusted his own son. Victor's hand tightened on the gun. My father was a paranoid old man who saw enemies everywhere. He spent his last years documenting every conversation, every transaction, every relationship he'd ever had. He even had me followed by private investigators. Because he knew what kind of man you really were. Because he knew I was smarter than him, Victor's voice carried years of buried resentment. He spent decades playing small-time blackmail games with petty corruption. I saw the bigger picture. This territory is about to become a state. When that happens, all the old territorial crimes will be forgotten. But the evidence in this room could still destroy families. Nathan began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy. You weren't protecting the status quo. You were positioning yourself to take over your father's operation. I was going to modernize it. Instead of bleeding these people dry, one payment at a time, I planned to offer them a final solution. One large payment to destroy all the evidence and guarantee their secrets stayed buried forever. Victor gestured at the filing cabinets around them. Do you have any idea what some of these families would pay for that kind of peace of mind? And James Miller was going to ruin that plan. James was going to turn all of this over to the territorial marshal out of some misguided sense of justice. He would have destroyed dozens of families and gained nothing in return except the satisfaction of being right. Victor's expression hardened. I couldn't allow that to happen. A sound from the front of the store made them both freeze. Footsteps and voices calling Nathan's name. Margaret Winters had returned, and she wasn't alone. In here, Nathan shouted before Victor could stop him. Bring the marshal! Victor swore and swung the gun toward the door just as Margaret appeared with two other men. One wore a badge and had his own weapon drawn before he had fully invaded the room. Drop the gun, Blackwood, the marshal commanded. We heard enough from outside to know what's going on. Instead of surrendering, Victor smiled. Marshal Williams, I should have expected you to be involved. After all, your name is on quite a few of these documents. The marshal's face went pale and his gun hand wavered slightly. Margaret looked between the two men with growing horror. That's right, Victor continued. My father documented everyone's crimes, including those of the people who were supposed to enforce the law. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk away from this building and forget what you heard. And in exchange, your family's reputation remains intact. The marshal stood frozen, caught between his duty and his fear. In that moment of hesitation, Nathan realized that the corruption ran even deeper than he'd imagined. The very people responsible for upholding justice were themselves criminals, trapped by Edmund Blackwood's methodical documentation of their crimes. But Margaret Winters stepped forward, her face set with determination. There's something you should know, Victor. Your father didn't just document crimes. He also documented solutions. She held up a small leather journal that she'd apparently taken from the desk while the men were confronting each other. This contains the names of every honest person in the territory. People who can be trusted to handle this evidence properly. People who aren't in your father's eyes because they never compromised their integrity. Victor's confident expression began to crack as he realized his leverage was slipping away. The standoff had become a three-way battle between justice, corruption, and self-preservation, with the outcome hanging in the balance. With the outcome hanging in the balance, the third man with Margaret stepped forward. Nathan saw the federal badge on his coat. "Deputy Federal Marshal Thompson," he announced. "Margaret Winters contacted me yesterday about suspicious activity involving territorial land records. Seems her instincts were correct." Victor's face went white. A federal marshal meant his corruption network couldn't protect him. These were crimes against federal territory, not local jurisdiction. "Everything you've said in this room has been heard by federal authority," Thompson continued, "including your confession to murdering James Miller and your conspiracy to obstruct justice." Marshal Williams slowly lowered his weapon, his career and freedom already lost. Victor's two companions at the front of the store had fled the moment they heard federal authority mentioned, abandoning him to face the consequences alone. "You have no idea what you're unleashing," Victor said desperately. "This evidence will destroy half the territory." "Then half the territory deserves to be destroyed," Margaret replied firmly. "James Miller died because he believed in truth over convenience. The least we can do is honor that belief." Federal Marshal Thompson moved carefully toward Victor, his weapon trained steadily. "Put down the gun, Mr. Blackwood. You're already facing federal charges for murder, conspiracy, and obstruction. Don't add attacking a federal officer to that list." For a moment, Victor seemed to consider fighting. Then his shoulders sagged and he dropped the gun to the floor. The sound echoed in the small room like a final judgment. Thompson secured Victor and Williams, while Margaret helped Nathan gather the most damaging evidence from the files. The photograph of James Miller's murder went directly to the federal marshal, along with Edmund Blackwood's detailed records of the conspiracy. A wind swept through the open doorway, stirring the dust that had settled over decades of secrets. In the flickering lantern light, Nathan caught Margaret's eye and saw something unexpected there. Not just righteousness, but personal grief. She had known James Miller better than she'd admitted. Perhaps she'd loved him. And all these years, she'd waited for someone to arrive who might finally uncover the truth. The sealed door stood open now, a barrier broken after 15 years of darkness. Whatever Edmund Blackwood had intended when he created his insurance policy, the truth was finally emerging into the light. And as the federal marshal led Victor Blackwood away in handcuffs, Nathan knew that the territorial capital would soon erupt in scandal as investigators worked through Edmund's meticulous documentation. Truth had a cost, but so did secrets, and some prices were too high to pay, no matter how comfortable the lies might be. Standing in the doorway of the store that evening, watching the sunset paint the Montana mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Nathan felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. The story he'd failed to expose in Chicago had broken him, but this story, hidden behind a sealed door in a forgotten corner of Montana territory, might be his redemption. The price of truth was high, but the weight of lies was higher still, a burden that crushed not just individuals but entire communities. As darkness fell over the small town, Nathan knew that morning would bring a new chapter, not just for him, but for a territory on the verge of statehood, a future that would now be built on exposed truths rather than buried secrets. Dawn broke over the small Montana town, painting the distant mountains with streaks of amber and gold. Nathan Hargrove stood at the window of his rented room, watching as the community stirred to life, unaware that the foundations of their society were about to crumble. The events of the previous evening played through his mind on an endless loop. The sealed door finally opened. Edmund Blackwood's meticulously documented evidence of corruption, Victor's confession, and the federal marshal's arrival. Truth had a momentum of its own now, a force that would sweep through this territory like a prairie fire. The sealed room had been emptied overnight, its contents transported to the federal marshal's office under armed guard. Files that had remained hidden for 15 years would soon expose the darkest secrets of Montana's most prominent families. A soft knock on his door pulled Nathan from his thoughts. Margaret Winters stood in the hallway, her usual composure replaced by an air of urgency. You need to see this, her voice tight with tension as she handed him the morning edition of the territorial newspaper. The headline struck him like a physical blow. Federal marshal found dead. Evidence in Blackwood case missing. The article detailed how Deputy Marshal Thompson had been discovered in his hotel room, apparently the victim of a heart attack similar to the one that had claimed James Miller 10 years earlier. More disturbing still, the evidence collected from Edmund Blackwood's secret room had vanished without a trace. Victor Blackwood remained in custody, but without the documentation, the case against him was significantly weakened. Margaret's fingers twisted nervously in her apron. They're already calling it a coincidence. A perfectly healthy man dies of a heart attack the same night he takes possession of evidence that could destroy half the powerful families in Montana Territory. History repeating itself. This isn't a coincidence. Nathan's jaw tightened as the implications became clear. The corruption runs deeper than we thought. Someone got to Thompson. That's not all. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. Sheriff Williams disappeared from his cell sometime during the night. The deputy claims he went to check on him this morning and found the cell empty, locked from the outside. No explanation of how he escaped. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting with each new revelation. The conspiracy is protecting itself. They're eliminating witnesses and destroying evidence. What do we do now? Margaret's question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of lives already lost. We still have one thing they don't. Nathan reached into his pocket and withdrew the leather journal Margaret had found on Edmund Blackwood's desk. Your list of honest people, Edmund's insurance policy against the corrupt. If we can't trust the law, then we need to find people who can help us recover that evidence before it's destroyed. Margaret nodded, her resolve strengthening. I recognize some names in that journal, people who've stood against the Blackwood influence for years. Good people who never bent to pressure or bribes. Nathan flipped through the small book, studying the names Edmund Blackwood had meticulously recorded. Each entry included not just a name, but notes on character, connections, and vulnerabilities. The same methodical documentation he had applied to his blackmail targets, but with a different purpose. We need to be careful, Nathan closed the journal. If they killed a federal marshal, they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone else who threatens them. Edmund Blackwood spent years building this network of honest citizens. We need to contact them without exposing them to danger. As they descended the stairs to the boarding house dining room, the hushed voices of other guests reached them. Fragments of conversation all centered on the marshal's mysterious death and the missing evidence. The story was spreading, but already being shaped by those with power and influence. Nathan and Margaret exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between them. The truth was still out there, preserved in those files, and they were perhaps the only people left in Montana Territory who knew exactly what those documents contained. The only people who could ensure that James Miller hadn't died in vain. But first, they needed to understand their enemy, and that meant a confrontation with the man at the center of the conspiracy. The territorial jail stood at the edge of town, a sturdy stone building with barred windows and heavy doors. Despite the morning's revelations, Victor Blackwood remained in custody, though for how long was anyone's guess. Without the evidence, the charges against him might not stand. The deputy on duty eyed Nathan suspiciously as he approached the front desk. No visitors for Blackwood. Judge's orders. Nathan leaned forward, lowering his voice. I was there last night when Federal Marshal Thompson arrested him. I have information about the missing evidence that might help your investigation. A flicker of uncertainty crossed the deputy's face. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded toward the cell block. 5 minutes, that's all. Victor Blackwood sat on a narrow cot in the corner of his cell, somehow managing to look composed despite his circumstances. The shadow of stubble on his jaw was the only indication of his night in custody. When he saw Nathan approaching, a smile spread across his face. Not the anxious expression of a defeated man, but the confident smirk of someone who still held cards to play. Mr. Hargrove, come to gloat? His voice carried none of the desperation from the previous evening. Nathan studied him through the iron bars. The marshal is dead. The evidence is gone. Your people have been busy. Victor's smile never wavered. Not my people, Mr. Hargrove. You still don't understand the scale of what you've stumbled into. This territory wasn't built by the Blackwood family alone. My father was just one piece in a much larger machine. A machine that murders federal marshals and makes evidence disappear. A machine that protects its interests. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. My father understood that. It's why he collected his insurance policy in the first place. Not to expose the system, but to secure his place within it. Nathan felt a chill despite the morning warmth. And you? I was making the same play, just more efficiently. One final payment to destroy the evidence rather than years of blackmail. The old families would have paid handsomely for that peace of mind. Instead, you forced my hand. By opening the door. By bringing the federal authorities into a territorial matter. Victor's voice hardened. Now the machine has been activated. They'll erase every trace of evidence, eliminate every witness, and ensure that statehood proceeds without interruption. Montana will join the Union with its secrets intact. They'll come for you too, Nathan realized. You're as much a liability as Thompson was. Victor's laugh held no humor. Why do you think I'm still alive? I know things that weren't in those files. Contingencies my father never documented. As long as I hold that knowledge, I have value. Or they're letting you take the fall while they clean up the mess. Something flickered in Victor's eyes, a moment of doubt quickly masked. They need me, just like they needed my father. The machine requires people like us to function. Your father thought the same thing until someone gave him a heart attack. Nathan pressed the advantage, seeing the uncertainty growing in Victor's expression. How long before they decide you're too much of a risk? How long before you have a convenient accident in your cell? Victor stood abruptly, approaching the bars. What do you want, Hargrove? Names. Who took the evidence? Who killed Thompson? Who's running this machine of yours? Victor studied him for a long moment, calculating. What's in it for me? A chance to save your own skin. Your father kept records of the honest people in this territory, along with the corrupt, people who might be able to protect you if you cooperate. A harsh laugh escaped Victor's lips. There are no honest people with enough power to stand against this. My father's little list of principled nobodies won't save you. They're good people, sure, but good people get buried while the machine rolls on. James Miller was one of those good people. He died trying to expose the truth. And look what it got him. Victor's voice dropped to a whisper. A shallow grave and a forgotten legacy. The same fate awaits anyone foolish enough to challenge the established order, including you. A commotion from the front of the jail interrupted their conversation. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by authoritative voices. The deputy appeared, flanked by two well-dressed men Nathan didn't recognize. Time's up, the deputy announced, not meeting Nathan's eyes. These gentlemen are from the territorial governor's office. They have release papers for Mr. Blackwood. The taller of the two men stepped forward, producing an official-looking document bearing the territorial seal. The charges have been dropped due to insufficient evidence. Mr. Blackwood is free to go. Victor's smile widened as the cell door swung open. What did I tell you, Hargrove? The machine protects its own. As Victor was escorted past him, he paused briefly. My advice, leave Montana territory while you still can. Take the old woman and go back east. Forget everything you saw in that room. Nathan watched as Victor Blackwood walked out a free man, less than 24 hours after confessing to murder. The corruption wasn't just deep, it was systemic, reaching all the way to the territorial governor's office. The message was clear. Power would protect itself, regardless of truth or justice. But as Nathan left the jail, determination hardened within him. He hadn't backed down in Chicago when powerful men threatened him, and he wouldn't back down now. The difference was that this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. Margaret was waiting outside, her face tight with concern. They released him, didn't they? Nathan nodded grimly. The governor's office intervened. The charges have been dropped. Then we're on our own. Margaret's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. We need to move quickly. If they can reach the governor's office, they can reach anyone. No one in authority can be trusted. They walked briskly back toward the boarding house, keeping their voices low, aware that in a small town, eyes and ears were everywhere. Victor confirmed what we suspected. Nathan glanced around, ensuring they weren't being followed. This goes beyond the Blackwood family. There's a larger organization protecting these secrets, powerful enough to kill a federal marshal and make evidence disappear overnight. It's the founding families. Margaret's certainty was absolute. The men who established this territory, who built fortunes from stolen land and forged claims. They've been controlling everything from the shadows for decades. And now they're about to become the founding fathers of a new state. Nathan completed the thought, with all their crimes safely buried in the past. They reached the boarding house and slipped inside, heading straight for Margaret's private sitting room at the back. Once the door was closed, Margaret retrieved Edmund Blackwood's journal from its hiding place behind a loose brick in the fireplace. We need to start contacting people from this list. She opened the journal, scanning the names. Edmund was careful about who he trusted. These people were selected because they had nothing to gain from maintaining the corruption and everything to lose if it continued. Nathan studied the first page of names. Out of these people are ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, farmers, tradesmen. How can they stand against the territorial government and the founding families? Because there are more of them than there are corrupt officials. Margaret's finger traced down the list. Nathan counted the marked locations, 7 in total, scattered across the territory. We can't search all these places ourselves. We'd need help. That's what the list is for. Margaret turned back to the names. We start with the people closest to us, the ones in town. We build a network, just like Edmund did. As they began formulating their plan, a knock at the front door interrupted their discussion. Margaret moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. "It's Eleanor Blackwood," she whispered, "Victor's wife." Nathan tensed. "She threatened me yesterday at the hardware store, said the building would bring misfortune to those who didn't respect its history. A warning that came true for Marshal Thompson." Margaret's face hardened. "She might be here to deliver a similar message to us. Or to negotiate," Nathan considered the possibilities. "Victor's free, but they know we have this journal. They'll want it back." Margaret hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "I'll speak with her. You stay out of sight." Nathan positioned himself behind the partially open door to the sitting room, close enough to intervene if necessary, but hidden from view. Margaret composed herself and went to answer the front door. Eleanor Blackwood's voice drifted through the house, cold and imperious. "I need to speak with Mr. Hargrove. I know he's here." "Mr. Hargrove is not receiving visitors." Margaret's reply was equally frigid. "This isn't a social call, Mrs. Winters. This is about his continued well-being. There have been unfortunate accidents recently. It would be a shame if another occurred." "Are you threatening him?" "I'm offering him an opportunity." Eleanor's tone softened slightly. $5,000 for the return of any materials he might have taken from the store. No questions asked. A generous severance package, you might say. Nathan stepped into view, unable to remain hidden while Margaret faced threats on his behalf. "Your husband offered me the same deal yesterday, before he confessed to murder." Eleanor Blackwood showed no surprise at his appearance, merely a calculated assessment. Unlike her husband, who veered between nervous anxiety and cold calculation, Eleanor projected consistent control. Her expensive dress and carefully arranged hair spoke of wealth maintained through generations, not newly acquired. "My husband is prone to dramatic exaggeration." Her lips curved in a smile that never reached her eyes. "Whatever he told you should be taken with considerable skepticism. He told me enough to understand that your family has been at the center of territorial corruption for decades." Nathan held her gaze steadily. "That Edmund Blackwood documented crimes that could send dozens of prominent citizens to prison. Ancient history," Eleanor dismissed with a wave of her gloved hand. "This territory is weeks away from statehood. The past will remain in the past, one way or another. The only question is whether you'll profit from your discretion or suffer for your interference. A federal marshal is dead." Margaret's voice shook with controlled anger. "Just like James Miller died 10 years ago. That's not ancient history, that's ongoing criminal conspiracy." Eleanor turned to her with a look of cold assessment. "Mrs. Winters, I'd forgotten your personal interest in the Miller situation. Still carrying a torch after all these years?" The barb found its mark. Margaret flinched slightly before recovering her composure. "We know about the machine," Nathan interjected, drawing Eleanor's attention back to him. The network of powerful families protecting their interests at any cost. Victor told us everything. Did he? Eleanor seemed genuinely amused. My husband has always overestimated his importance in the greater scheme of things. He was useful to certain interests, as was his father before him. But the Blackwoods have never been more than middle management in Montana's power structure. The casual dismissal of her own family's significance caught Nathan off guard. Then who's really in control? People whose names would mean nothing to you. Eleanor studied her gloves, adjusting them with deliberate precision. People who were building this territory while Edmund Blackwood was still keeping their books and handling their dirty work. People who will ensure that Montana enters the Union unburdened by scandal. People who murder federal marshals when convenient, Nathan pressed. Eleanor's eyes flashed dangerously. People who protect their legacy at any cost, as would anyone with something valuable to preserve. She reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the small table by the door. My offer stands. $5,000 for any materials you've recovered from the store. A fair price for your silence and departure from Montana territory. And if we refuse? Margaret's question hung in the air between them. Then I can't guarantee your safety. Eleanor's honesty was chilling in its directness. The wheels are already in motion. Statehood will not be delayed or derailed by ancient indiscretions. Those who stand in the way will be removed. With that final warning delivered, she turned and left, the scent of expensive perfume lingering in her wake. Nathan picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of the money inside. $5,000, the same amount Victor offered yesterday. Blood money, Margaret's voice was tight with emotion, paid for with James's life and now Marshall Thompson's. Nathan tossed the envelope onto the table. They're getting desperate, making direct threats, offering bribes. They know we have something they want. The journal, Margaret nodded toward the leather-bound book. Edmund's list of honest citizens and his map of evidence locations, the last pieces of his insurance policy they haven't managed to destroy. Which means we need to move quickly. Nathan returned to the sitting room, examining the map once more. The closest location to us is here, about 3 miles outside of town. If Edmund hid duplicate evidence there, we might still have a chance to expose everything. Margaret gathered her shawl, determination evident in every movement. I'll arrange for horses. We can be there and back before nightfall. As Margaret prepared for their expedition, Nathan studied Edmund Blackwood's journal more carefully. The list of names was extensive, covering not just the town but the entire territory. Each entry included personal details that might prove useful in determining who could be trusted. Edmund had been methodical in his assessment of character, noting not just integrity but courage, influence, and resources. One name in particular caught Nathan's attention: Robert Carson, listed as printer, territorial newspaper, Helena. The notation beside the name read, "Incorruptible, published expose on mining claim fraud despite threats, has connections to Eastern newspapers, a potential ally with the means to spread the truth beyond Montana's borders. If they could recover Edmund's evidence and get it to Carson, the story might reach newspapers in Chicago, New York, or Washington. The federal government wouldn't be able to ignore corruption that threatened to taint a new state's admission to the Union." Margaret returned, her face grave. "We have a problem. The livery stable won't rent us horses. The owner claims all his animals are spoken for, but I saw at least a dozen in the corral. They're isolating us," Nathan realized, "cutting off our ability to move freely." "It's worse than that," Margaret lowered her voice. "While I was there, I overheard 2 men talking about searching the boarding house. They mentioned your name specifically." Nathan glanced toward the window, noticing for the first time a man loitering across the street, his attention fixed on the boarding house. "They're watching us, waiting for an opportunity to search for the journal. We need to leave town." Margaret's decision was immediate. "My sister has a farm about 10 miles north. We can go there, regroup, and plan our next move. We'll need transportation." Nathan considered their options. "And we need to leave without being followed." Margaret moved to a cabinet, withdrawing a small Derringer pistol, which she tucked into her pocket. "There's a delivery wagon that brings supplies to the boarding house every Wednesday. It should arrive within the hour. The driver, Thomas, is on Edmund's list. We can trust him." True to Margaret's prediction, the supply wagon arrived just as the town church bell struck noon. Thomas Fuller was a weathered man in his 50s, with the solid build of someone who'd spent a lifetime loading and unloading heavy goods. As Margaret helped check in the weekly delivery, she managed a whispered conversation out of sight of the watchers. When she returned to the sitting room, her expression was grim but determined. Thomas will help us. There's a false bottom in his wagon where he sometimes transports goods to avoid the territorial tax collectors. We can hide there when he leaves. When? In about an hour. Margaret began gathering essential supplies. We need to be ready, and we need to ensure the journal stays safe, regardless of what happens to us. Nathan nodded, understanding the implications. They were now officially fugitives, fleeing from people with the power and authority to make them disappear. Just like James Miller and Marshall Thompson, they had become inconvenient obstacles to be removed. As Margaret prepared, Nathan made a copy of the map from Edmund's journal, carefully transcribing the locations marked as potential evidence caches. He also copied several names from the list of trustworthy citizens, focusing on those with skills or positions that might prove useful in their fight against the corruption. The hour passed with agonizing slowness. Through the window, Nathan observed two more men join the watcher across the street. They were making no attempt to hide their surveillance now, a clear message that the boarding house was under observation. They're getting bolder. Nathan nodded toward the window, three men watching openly. Margaret barely glanced up from her packing. That's because they're waiting for reinforcements. Once night falls, they'll make their move. How can you be so sure? Because that's how they've always operated. Bitterness edged her voice. They're cowards at heart, striking from the shadows when they think no one is watching. I've seen their methods before when they came for James. Nathan studied her face, seeing the pain of old wounds still unhealed. You and James were close, weren't you? We were to be married. Margaret's hands stilled on the bag she was packing. The week after he died, he promised that once he solved the mystery of Edmund's door, we would leave this town together, start fresh somewhere untainted by the Blackwood's influence. The pieces finally clicked into place. Margaret's decade-long quest for justice, her immediate interest in Nathan's investigation, her willingness to risk everything to expose the truth. I'm sorry, Nathan's words seemed inadequate against such profound loss. Don't be sorry, Margaret's eyes hardened with resolve. Be angry. Be determined. James deserves justice, and so does Marshall Thompson, and every other person who's been crushed by the machine that runs this territory. A soft whistle from the back of the house signaled Thomas's readiness. Moving quickly and quietly, they gathered their belongings and the precious journal, slipping out through the kitchen door to where the delivery wagon waited in the narrow alley behind the boarding house. Thomas helped them into the hidden compartment beneath the wagon bed, a space barely large enough for two people to lie side by side. Stay quiet, his voice hushed with urgency. There's a checkpoint at the edge of town. The sheriff's men are stopping every vehicle. The false bottom was sealed above them, plunging them into darkness broken only by thin slits that allowed minimal air circulation. Nathan felt Margaret's hand find his in the darkness, her grip firm despite the fear that must have been coursing through her. The wagon lurched into motion, each bump and jolt amplified in their confined space. Through the narrow slits, Nathan caught glimpses of the town passing by. The general store where this had all begun, the jail where Victor had walked free, the newspaper office posting the story of Marshall Thompson's convenient heart attack. A town built on corruption, soon to become part of a state founded on buried crimes. The very embodiment of the American dream's shadow side, where fortunes were built not just on hard work and determination, but on theft, fraud, and occasionally murder. The wagon slowed as they approached the edge of town. Metal voices called for Thomas to halt, followed by the creak of the wagon as someone climbed aboard to inspect the cargo. What's in the crates? A gruff voice demanded. Just the usual supplies for the boarding house, Thomas replied, his tone carefully neutral. Flour, sugar, coffee. Got the invoice right here if you want to check it. Footsteps moved across the wagon bed directly above them. Nathan held his breath, acutely aware that only a thin layer of wood separated them from discovery. You seen a man named Hargrove, tall fellow, from back east, or the Winters woman from the boarding house? Can't say that I have, Thomas answered. Been on the road since dawn, making deliveries. Something happen? Just routine questions. The voice grew suspicious. Mind if we check under the wagon? Been some smuggling lately. Nathan's heart pounded as he heard someone drop to the ground beside the wagon. The sound of boots scuffing in the dirt came closer as the man bent to look beneath the vehicle. "What's that compartment there?" the voice called out. Thomas's response was immediate and rehearsed. "Tax collector's special. You boys know how it is with these territorial tariffs. A man's got to make a living." A laugh from the inspector suggested understanding of such minor infractions. "Don't we all? Just make sure it's only tax dodging you're up to, Fuller. There's serious business happening today." "Wouldn't dream of crossing the law." Thomas's relief was palpable even through the wooden barrier. "We still good to go?" "Yeah, move along, but keep your eyes open for Hargrove and the Winters woman. Sheriff wants them brought in for questioning about that business at the old Blackwood store." The wagon lurched forward again, continuing past the checkpoint and onto the open road leading north out of town. Only when they were well beyond the town limits did Thomas rap on the floor, signaling that it was safe to speak. "That was too close." His voice was tight with tension. "They're searching every building in town for you two. Got the territorial militia involved now. Whatever you've stirred up, it's got the big families running scared." "The militia?" Margaret's whisper held disbelief. "They're using government forces for a private vendetta?" "That's how it works around here," Thomas replied grimly. "The line between public authority and private interest disappeared long ago. The founding families are the government, far as most folks are concerned." They traveled in tense silence for several miles, the wagon bouncing along the rutted dirt road leading away from town. Through the air slits, Nathan watched as the landscape changed from buildings to open prairie, the vast Montana sky stretching endlessly above them. Freedom was an illusion, he realized. Even in this seemingly boundless territory, the reach of corrupt power extended to every corner. There was nowhere to hide from a system that controlled the law, the government, and the militia. Their only hope was to fight back with the one weapon Edmund Blackwood had left them, the truth, documented in evidence he'd hidden across the territory. Evidence they now had a chance to recover, thanks to the map in his journal. The wagon slowed, turning onto a less traveled path that wound through a stand of cottonwood trees. After several minutes, it came to a complete stop. "We're clear," Thomas announced. "No one followed us. You can come out now." The false bottom was removed, allowing Nathan and Margaret to emerge from their cramped hiding place. They found themselves in a small clearing surrounded by trees, the wagon positioned to be invisible from the main road. "We're about 5 miles from town," Thomas explained, helping Margaret down from the wagon. "My regular route takes me another 3 miles up this way to the Carson homestead. From there, it's about 2 miles cross-country to your sister's farm." Margaret stretched, working the stiffness from her limbs after the confined journey. "Thank you, Thomas. You've taken a terrible risk helping us." "Edmund Blackwood saved my farm once." Thomas's weathered face grew solemn. "When the big mining company tried to claim my water rights, he found the documents proving my prior claim and stood by me in court. Said he was just evening the scales a bit. I owe him." "There are others who feel the same way," Margaret indicated the journal. "People who benefited from Edmund's quiet interventions against the corrupt power structure. People who might help us now." Thomas nodded. "Word's spreading already. The marshal's death wasn't as clean as they wanted. People are asking questions. Your disappearance will only fuel the speculation. We need to recover Edmund's evidence before they find it all." Nathan unfolded the copied map. "The closest cache is here, about a mile from where we are now." Thomas studied the map, recognition dawning on his face. "That's the old mining office. Been abandoned since the claim played out 10 years ago. Edmund used to handle the books for that operation." "The perfect place to hide incriminating documents," Margaret nodded. "Who would look for evidence in an abandoned mine office?" "We should check it now while we have daylight," Nathan decided. "Thomas, can you wait for us? We may need to make a quick departure if the location is being watched." Thomas agreed, and they set off through the trees, following a faint path that wound deeper into the wooded area. The abandoned mining office appeared suddenly before them, a small wooden structure with boarded windows and a sagging roof, nearly swallowed by the surrounding vegetation. Nature was reclaiming the site, wild grasses growing through the warped floorboards of the small porch. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, offering little resistance when Nathan pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of light, filtering through gaps in the boarded windows. A desk stood against one wall, its surface covered in years of accumulated grime. Empty shelves lined another wall, while a pot-bellied stove occupied the corner, cold and silent for a decade. According to the map, the evidence should be here somewhere, Mr. Nathan examined the small room carefully. Edmund would have chosen a hiding place that wouldn't be disturbed, even if someone entered the building. Margaret moved to the stove, opening its rusted door. Empty, not even ashes remain. Nathan examined the desk, pulling open drawers filled with nothing but dust and mouse droppings. The shelves yielded nothing, nor did a careful inspection of the floorboards for signs of a hiding place. "It's not here," frustration edged his voice. "Either Edmund's map is wrong or someone found it before us." Margaret stood in the center of the room, turning slowly as she surveyed their surroundings. Edmund wouldn't have marked this location without reason. "We're missing something." Her gaze settled on the ceiling, where wooden beams supported the sagging roof. "Nathan, look! That beam over the desk. It's different from the others." Nathan followed her gaze, noting that one beam appeared slightly newer than the surrounding woodwork. Standing on the desk for a better view, he discovered a small compartment carved into the beam, invisible from below. Inside was an oilskin packet, carefully sealed against the elements. Heart racing, he retrieved the package and jumped down from the desk. Together, they unwrapped the oilskin, revealing a stack of documents and photographs similar to those they discovered in the sealed room at the store. "He did make copies." Margaret's voice trembled with vindication as she examined the first document, a land deed showing how a prominent territorial family had seized property from a Blackfoot settlement through forged signatures and threats of violence. The evidence was damning. Detailed records of fraudulent mining claims, witness testimonies about murders disguised as accidents, financial documents showing bribes paid to territorial officials. Each page represented another link in the chain of corruption that had built Montana Territory. "This is enough to start with." Nathan carefully rewrapped the packet. "If we can get this to Robert Carson at the newspaper in Helena, he can begin publishing the evidence. Once it's in print, they can't suppress it as easily." Margaret nodded, hope kindling in her eyes for the first time since they'd fled town. "Helena is 70 miles north. With Thomas's help, we might reach it in 3 days." As they secured the precious packet, a sound from outside froze them in place, the unmistakable rhythm of approaching horses, moving at a steady trot toward the abandoned office. Nathan moved quickly to the window, peering through a gap in the boards. 4 mounted men approached from the direction of town, rifles clearly visible across their saddles. At their head rode Victor Blackwood, his expression set with grim determination. "They found us." Nathan's voice was tight with urgency. "Victor's leading them, right to us." Margaret's hand moved to the derringer in her pocket. "How? No one followed us from town." Realization struck Nathan like a physical blow. The map, Edmund's map. Victor knew about his father's backup evidence locations. He's not following us. He's following the same map we are, trying to destroy the remaining evidence before we can find it. They had seconds, perhaps a minute at most, before Victor and his men reached the office. The windows were boarded, offering no escape route. The only exit was the front door, which would lead them directly into the path of their pursuers. "The stovepipe," Margaret pointed to where the metal chimney rose through the ceiling. "It's wide enough for a person to climb, and the roof is only about 8 feet up. We could escape through the back while they're entering from the front." Nathan moved quickly, shoving the desk beneath the stovepipe to create a makeshift climbing platform. "You go first. I'll pass you the evidence once you're up." Margaret climbed onto the desk and reached for the pipe, using it to pull herself up through the opening. Nathan handed her the oilskin packet, then began his own ascent as the sound of horses stopped outside the office. He emerged onto the sloped roof just as the office door crashed open below. Staying low, they crawled to the back edge of the small building. The drop was only about 8 feet to the ground, but they would be exposed the moment they moved from the cover of the roof. "Through the trees," Margaret whispered, indicating a dense thicket about 20 yards away. "If we can reach that, we might circle back to where Thomas is waiting." Voice drifted up from inside the office, Victor directing his men to search every corner of the small building. They had moments at most before someone thought to check the roof. Nathan lowered himself over the edge, hanging by his fingertips to reduce the drop before letting go. He landed with a soft thud, immediately moving to help Margaret down beside him. Together, they sprinted for the cover of the thicket, the precious evidence packet clutched tightly against Nathan's chest. They had covered half the distance when a shout erupted behind them. "There they are! Behind the building!" Gunfire erupted, bullets splintering tree bark around them as they plunged into the protective cover of the dense undergrowth. Crouching low, they pushed deeper into the thicket, thorns tearing at their clothing as they forced a path through the tangled vegetation. "Spread out!" Victor's voice carried clearly in the afternoon air. "Find them! They have my father's documents!" Nathan and Margaret moved as quickly as the dense growth allowed, changing direction frequently to confuse their pursuers. Behind them, they could hear men crashing through the undergrowth, following their trail. "We need to split up," Nathan made the decision as they reached a small stream cutting through the woods. "They're after the evidence. I'll take it and lead them away. You circle back to Thomas." Margaret shook her head firmly. "No. Edmund's map shows another cache 5 miles north of here. If we're separated, one of us needs to continue recovering the evidence. You take this packet to Thomas and get to Helena. I'll recover the next cache and meet you at my sister's farm." Before Nathan could protest, she produced a small compass from her pocket. "I know these woods better than you do. Trust me, Nathan. This is the right play." In that moment, with pursuers closing in and time running out, he saw in Margaret the same determination that had sustained her through 10 years of waiting for justice. The same courage that had drawn her to James Miller, and now to this dangerous quest for truth. Nathan handed her the copied map. "Be careful. Victor's desperate now." "So am I." Margaret's eyes flashed with resolve. "We all are. The difference is we're fighting for something worth dying for." With that, she slipped away, following the stream northward toward the next cache location. Nathan watched her go, then turned in the opposite direction, the oilskin packet secure inside his coat. If Victor and his men followed the more obvious trail, they would pursue him rather than Margaret. The sounds of pursuit grew closer as Nathan pushed through the undergrowth, deliberately leaving signs of his passage. Broken branches, disturbed ground, everything to draw attention away from Margaret's more careful retreat. The strategy worked. Within minutes, he heard voices converging on his position. Victor's men had picked up his trail and were closing in from multiple directions. Nathan increased his pace, breaking free of the thicket into a small clearing. He was halfway across when a mounted figure burst from the trees ahead, cutting off his escape route. Victor Blackwood himself, rifle leveled directly at Nathan's chest. "That's far enough, Hargrove." Victor's voice was cold with triumph. "Hand over my father's documents." Nathan froze, acutely aware of the rustling behind him as more of Victor's men emerged from the undergrowth, encircling him. There was nowhere to run, no escape from the weapons trained on him from all directions. "You can't suppress the truth forever, Victor." Nathan stood his ground despite the hopelessness of his position. "Even if you get these documents, there are others. Your father made sure of that." "My father was a sentimental old fool who couldn't see the bigger picture." Victor dismounted, approaching with his rifle still aimed at Nathan. He thought his little insurance policy would protect him from the very powers he served. Instead, it got him killed. The admission hung in the air between them. "You murdered your own father." "I executed a liability." Victor's correction was matter of fact. "Just as I executed James Miller when he got too close to the truth. Just as these men will execute you unless you hand over those documents right now." Nathan's mind raced, searching for options, for any path that might lead to survival. Not just his own, but survival of the truth that Edmund Blackwood had died to preserve. In the distance, a gunshot echoed through the trees, a single report that momentarily distracted Victor and his men. It came from the direction Thomas had been waiting with the wagon. That momentary distraction was all Nathan needed. He hurled the oilskin packet into the undergrowth, then charged directly at Victor, tackling him before he could bring his rifle to bear. They went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling across the forest floor as Victor's men hesitated, unable to shoot without risking their employer. Victor fought with the desperation of a man who knew the stakes. His fist connected with Nathan's jaw, sending stars exploding across his vision. Nathan returned the blow, driving his knuckles into Victor's ribs, feeling something give beneath the impact. More gunshots sounded in the distance, closer now. Victor's men looked toward the sound, their attention divided between the approaching threat and the struggle before them. Nathan seized the moment, delivering a final blow that sent Victor sprawling backward. Leaping to his feet, he dove for the undergrowth where he'd thrown the evidence, grabbing the packet and rolling deeper into the protective cover as bullets tore through the vegetation around him. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of new figures approaching, men on horseback, moving with purpose. Not Victor's men, but strangers responding to the sounds of conflict. "Territory Marshal!" a voice bellowed across the clearing. "Drop your weapons!" And the declaration froze everyone in place. Victor's men looked to their employer for direction, but Victor himself was struggling to his feet, blood streaming from his nose where Nathan's fist had connected. "These men are trespassing on private property," Victor called back, attempting to regain control of the situation. "We're simply defending what's ours." A man on horseback emerged from the trees, badge gleaming on his chest. Not a local sheriff or deputy, but a territorial marshal, another federal officer with jurisdiction throughout Montana. "Marshal Cooper," the man introduced himself, surveying the scene with experienced eyes. "Got word from the federal office that Deputy Marshal Thompson went missing after making an arrest in these parts. Would any of you gentlemen know something about that?" Victor straightened, adjusting his clothing as he attempted to project authority. "A tragic incident, Marshal. Thompson suffered a heart attack in his hotel room. Nothing suspicious about it." "That's so." Marshal Cooper's skepticism was evident. "Because I received a telegram this morning from a federal judge ordering me to investigate Thompson's death and the disappearance of evidence in a major corruption case." Hope surged through Nathan as he realized what had happened. Margaret's plan had worked. Word had reached beyond the territory's borders. The federal government was responding, sending representatives who weren't part of the local corruption. "Marshal," Nathan stepped forward, clutching the oilskin packet. "I have evidence documenting decades of corruption among territorial officials and founding families. Documents that were stolen from Deputy Marshal Thompson before his death." Cooper dismounted, approaching with caution. "You Hargrove? The journalist from Chicago?" Nathan nodded, surprised to be recognized. "Thompson sent a telegram to the federal office the night he was killed," Cooper explained. "Named you as a witness in a case involving multiple territorial officials. Said you'd helped uncover evidence of widespread corruption." The revelation stunned everyone present. Thompson had taken precautions, ensuring that his investigation wouldn't die with him. The machine wasn't as all-powerful as Victor had claimed. There were still federal authorities beyond its reach. "This man is wanted for questioning in a territorial matter." Victor attempted to reassert control. "My men and I have authority to detain him." "Your authority just got superseded." Cooper nodded to his deputies, who moved to disarm Victor's men. "By order of the federal court, I'm taking jurisdiction of this case and all related evidence." Victor's carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The protection he'd counted on, the machine that was supposed to shield him from consequences, had failed to account for federal authorities acting independently of territorial influence. As Cooper's deputies secured the scene, Nathan handed over the oilskin packet containing Edmund Blackwood's damning evidence. "There's more," he explained, "hidden in locations across the territory. And there's a woman, Margaret Winters, who's recovering additional documents as we speak." Cooper nodded grimly. "We'll find her, and we'll recover everything." The federal government takes a dim view of territories entering the Union with their foundations built on corruption, especially when that corruption extends to the murder of a federal officer. Nathan watched as Victor Blackwood was placed in custody, the arrogance finally stripped from his face. The man who had ordered James Miller's death, who had murdered his own father, who had orchestrated Marshal Thompson's heart attack, was finally facing justice he couldn't manipulate or evade. But the victory felt incomplete. Margaret was still out there, potentially in danger as she sought the next cache of evidence. And the powerful interest behind Victor, the true machine that controlled Montana territory, remained largely untouched. This was just the beginning of their fight. The sealed door had been opened, but the full extent of the corruption it concealed was still emerging into the light. And somewhere in the territory, the men who had built their fortunes and power on crime and corruption were preparing to protect their interests at any cost. As Marshal Cooper's men led Victor away, Nathan gazed toward the north, where Margaret had disappeared into the wilderness. The battle for Montana's soul was just beginning, and the price of truth would be measured not just in documents and evidence, but in the lives of those brave enough to stand against entrenched power. Territorial Marshal Cooper's arrival had shifted the balance of power, his federal authorities superseding the local corruption that had protected the Blackwood family for decades. Nathan watched as Victor and his men were disarmed and placed under arrest, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and anger as the protection they'd counted on evaporated beneath the weight of federal jurisdiction. "We need to find Margaret Winters," Nathan explained the situation to Cooper as they mounted up. "She's gone to recover more evidence from another of Edmund Blackwood's hiding places." Cooper nodded, his weathered face betraying little emotion, but his eyes sharp with assessment. "Johnson, take Blackwood and his men back to town. Secure them in the federal office, not the local jail. Trust no one in local law enforcement." Two deputies departed with the prisoners while Cooper, Nathan, and the remaining deputies turned their horses northward, following the path Margaret had taken hours earlier. The forest grew denser as they rode, shadows lengthening as afternoon gave way to early evening. Nathan's concern deepened with each passing mile. Margaret was out there alone, potentially pursued by others loyal to the machine that controlled Montana territory. "Tell me more about these documents." Cooper kept his voice low as they rode side by side. "What exactly did Edmund Blackwood document?" Nathan described the photographs and ledgers they discovered in the sealed room, the meticulous records of land theft, fraudulent mining claims, and murdered competitors. Edmund was the middleman for these crimes, but he kept evidence as insurance against his partners. When they murdered him, they thought they'd buried his secrets for good. "Until you bought his store for $99. Cooper's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Quite the bargain. Edmund designed that sealed room with a complex locking mechanism. When his son Victor killed him, no one could access the evidence inside. Victor spent 15 years trying to ensure it stayed buried." Cooper's eyes narrowed as he processed this information. "And Margaret Winters? What's her stake in this?" "She was engaged to James Miller, a carpenter who tried to open that door 10 years ago. Victor murdered him to protect the family secrets. She's been waiting a decade for justice." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of gunfire echoing through the trees ahead. A single shot, followed by two more in rapid succession. Cooper signaled for silence, then directed his deputies to spread out as they advanced cautiously toward the source of the gunfire. They emerged at the edge of a small clearing dominated by a dilapidated cabin. The weathered structure had once served as a hunting lodge, judging by the deer antlers still mounted above the door. But it was the scene in front of the cabin that froze Nathan's blood. Margaret Winters knelt on the ground, hands bound behind her back. Behind her stood Eleanor Blackwood, a pistol pressed against Margaret's temple. Three men with rifles surrounded them, their weapons trained on the tree line. "Federal Marshal!" Cooper's voice cut through the tense silence. "Lower your weapons." Eleanor's laugh carried across the clearing, cold and without humor. "Another federal officer? You people are becoming a nuisance." "Mrs. Blackwood, you're holding a hostage at gunpoint in front of federal witnesses." Cooper remained calm, professional. "That's a serious offense. Release Mrs. Winters and we can discuss this reasonably." "There's nothing reasonable about what's happening here." Eleanor's grip on the pistol never wavered. "My husband has been arrested, my family's reputation is in tatters, and 15 years of careful planning is unraveling because of this woman and her journalist friend." Nathan scanned the situation, looking for any advantage. Margaret's face was bruised, a trickle of blood running from her split lip, but her eyes remained defiant. At her feet lay an open oilskin packet, documents scattered across the ground where Eleanor had obviously examined them. "The evidence is already in federal hands," Nathan called out, hoping to defuse the situation. "Marshal Cooper has the documents from the first cache. Killing Margaret won't change anything now." Eleanor's eyes flashed with cold calculation. "Perhaps not, but it would provide a small measure of satisfaction after what she's cost my family. Your family built its fortune on crime." Margaret's voice was steady despite her precarious position. "Your husband murdered James and your father-in-law. How many other deaths are on your conscience, Eleanor?" The pistol pressed harder against Margaret's temple. "Conscience is a luxury for those without vision. The Blackwoods helped build this territory. We created order from chaos, civilization from wilderness. A few necessary sacrifices along the way don't change that legacy. Is that how you justify murder? Nathan took a careful step forward, drawing Eleanor's attention away from Margaret. By calling it necessary sacrifice, I justify nothing. Eleanor's response was sharp with pride. History is written by the victors, Mr. Hargrove. The Blackwoods and families like ours have shaped this territory's destiny. We will be remembered as founders and pioneers, not as criminals. Cooper used the distraction to signal his deputies into better positions surrounding the clearing. Mrs. Blackwood, this ends now. Release your hostage and surrender your weapon. Eleanor seemed to consider her options, weighing the pistol in her hand as she assessed the encircling federal officers. For a terrible moment, Nathan thought she might shoot Margaret out of pure spite, accepting her own fate as long as she could extract one final revenge. Instead, she lowered the weapon slightly. What guarantee do I have that my family will be treated fairly? You'll have a trial according to federal law, Cooper replied, the same as any citizen. That's all I can promise. A bitter smile crossed Eleanor's face. Law, such a malleable concept in a territory striving for statehood. You know as well as I do that political considerations will outweigh justice in the end. With surprising swiftness, she shoved Margaret forward and raised her pistol, not toward the federal officers, but to her own temple. The Blackwood name may fall, but it will not be dragged through the humiliation of a public trial. Nathan lunged forward, but the crack of the pistol echoed through the clearing before he could reach her. Eleanor Blackwood crumpled to the ground, the architect of her family's modern corruption, choosing death over disgrace. The armed men surrounding them immediately dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender as Cooper's deputies moved in to secure them. Nathan rushed to Margaret, helping her to her feet and untying her bonds. Are you all right? His hands shook slightly as he examined the bruise darkening her cheek. I've endured worse these past 10 years. Margaret rubbed her wrists where the ropes had cut into her skin. They caught me just as I found the cash. Eleanor was already here, searching for it herself. She knew about Edmund's hiding places, Nathan realized. She was trying to destroy all the evidence before it could reach federal authorities. Margaret nodded toward the scattered documents. She didn't succeed. Edmund hid copies of everything, land deeds with forged signatures, witness testimonies about murders, financial records showing bribes to territorial officials. He documented it all. Cooper approached, holstering his weapon as his deputies secured the scene. We'll need to collect all of this for the federal investigation. The judge and Helena will want to see everything. Helena, Margaret's eyes widened with sudden urgency. We need to get this evidence to Robert Carson at the territorial newspaper. If it's published, they can't suppress it, even if they manage to interfere with the federal investigation. Carson's on Edmund's list of honest citizens, Nathan explained to Cooper. A newspaper editor who stood against corruption before. If he publishes even part of this evidence, it could reach papers back east. The federal government would have to respond. Cooper considered this, weighing his responsibilities against the practical reality of their situation. The territorial government is already moving to contain this. I've received telegrams ordering me to keep all evidence confidential pending review by the governor's office. The same governor's office that released Victor from jail yesterday? Nathan's frustration boiled over. The corruption reaches the highest levels of the territorial government. We can't trust the official channels. The decision crystallized in Cooper's eyes. Johnson, escort Mrs. Winters and Mr. Hargrove to Helena. Ensure they reach the newspaper office safely. The rest of us will continue recovering evidence from the remaining locations on the map. As they prepared to depart, Cooper pulled Nathan aside. I'm risking my career on this. Make sure Carson understands what he's publishing. Once it's in print, there's no going back. The territorial government will try to discredit it, label it as sensationalism or fabrication. Carson will recognize the authenticity. Margaret joined them, the recovered documents secured in a saddlebag. Edmund's documentation is meticulous, with multiple sources corroborating each claim. The truth will stand on its own merits. They rode through the night, pushing their horses as hard as they dared over the rough terrain. Deputy Johnson led them on trails that avoided main roads and settlements, wary of interception by those loyal to the territorial government. By dawn, the buildings of Helena appeared on the horizon, the territorial capital and seat of the very power structure they sought to expose. Helena in 1889 stood as a testament to the mineral wealth that had built Montana Territory. Grand buildings of stone and brick lined the main streets, housing government offices, banks, and the mansions of mining magnates. The stark contrast between this opulence and the hardscrabble existence of most territorial residents was a visual reminder of the inequality Edmund Blackwood had documented so meticulously. The newspaper office occupied a modest building several blocks from the territorial capital. As they approached, Nathan noted a man watching from the doorway, middle-aged with ink-stained fingers and sharp, observant eyes. Robert Carson, editor of the Territorial Tribune, had the wary look of someone who'd spent years publishing unpopular truths in a place where such actions carried significant risk. "Mrs. Winters? Mr. Hargrove?" Carson stepped forward to meet them as they dismounted. "I received a telegram from Margaret's sister yesterday. Said you might be coming with a story that needed telling." Margaret's network had been working in the background, preparing the way while they gathered evidence. Inside the newspaper office, Carson cleared space on a large desk as they laid out the documents recovered from Edmund's hiding places. His expression grew increasingly grave as he examined the evidence of decades of corruption. "I've suspected much of this for years." Carson's fingers traced a land deed showing property stolen from a Blackfoot settlement through forged signatures. "Tried to publish what I could prove, but the evidence was always too circumstantial for anything beyond vague implications." This, however, he lifted a photograph showing territorial officials accepting money from mining company representatives, names and dates meticulously noted beneath. "This is irrefutable. Edmund Blackwood has handed us the story of the century." Deputy Johnson positioned himself by the window, watching the street outside with professional vigilance. "How quickly can you publish?" "For something this explosive, I'd normally take days to verify every detail." Carson ran a hand through his graying hair. "But given the circumstances, we can have a special edition on the streets by this evening. The basic facts, with the promise of more details to follow." "Focus on the murders first," Nathan suggested. "James Miller, Marshall Thompson, and Edmund Blackwood himself. Those crimes will resonate most strongly with the public." "And send copies to newspapers in Chicago, New York, and Washington," Margaret added. "Once this spreads beyond Montana, the federal government will have to respond, regardless of territorial pressure." Carson nodded, already organizing the documents into categories for his reporters to process. "I have contacts at several major Eastern papers, former colleagues who will ensure this gets the attention it deserves." As Carson's staff began the work of preparing the explosive expose, Deputy Johnson received a telegram from Marshal Cooper. The news was both encouraging and alarming. 2 more evidence caches had been recovered intact, but Cooper's team had encountered armed resistance at the 4th location. One deputy had been wounded in the exchange of gunfire, and the territorial militia had been mobilized, ostensibly to maintain order, but effectively impeding the federal investigation. "They're moving faster than we anticipated." Johnson's concern was evident as he shared the news. "The governor has issued a statement questioning the legitimacy of our federal authority in what he's calling internal territorial matters. They're trying to frame this as a jurisdictional dispute." Nathan recognized the strategy from his days as an investigative journalist. "Bury the crimes beneath layers of legal maneuvering and procedural objections." "It won't work once the evidence is public," Carson reassured them, though his expression remained troubled. "But we should expect retaliation once we publish. They'll try to seize the printing press, possibly arrest me on fabricated charges." "We need to protect the original documents," Margaret suggested. "Send copies to trusted individuals across the territory and beyond. Create too many sources for them to suppress." The strategy took shape as the day progressed. Carson's reporters worked feverishly to prepare the special edition, while trusted messengers carried copies of key documents to individuals named in Edmund's Journal of Honest Citizens. Deputy Johnson coordinated with the remaining federal marshals, establishing a protective presence around the newspaper office. By mid-afternoon, the first warnings of trouble arrived. A friendly clerk from the territorial governor's office sent word that arrest warrants were being prepared for Nathan, Margaret, and Carson on charges of sedition and spreading false information detrimental to public order. More ominously, the territorial militia had been ordered to secure the newspaper office for public safety. They're moving to shut us down before we can publish. Carson's determination only seemed to strengthen in the face of the threat. We need to accelerate our timeline. The printing press roared to life an hour later, churning out copies of the special edition with its devastating headline, Territorial Corruption Exposed. Murder, fraud, and theft built Montana's fortunes. The first bundles of newspapers had just been loaded onto delivery wagons when the sound of approaching horses signaled the arrival of the territorial militia. A dozen armed men in makeshift uniforms surrounded the building, led by a corpulent officer whose uniform strained against his considerable girth. By order of the territorial governor, this establishment is closed pending investigation into seditious activities, the officer's proclamation carried through the open windows. All persons inside are commanded to surrender themselves and any materials related to the slanderous publications being prepared. Deputy Johnson stepped onto the front porch of the newspaper office, federal badge displayed prominently on his chest. This building is under federal protection as part of an ongoing investigation into corruption and the murder of a federal officer. Your territorial authority is superseded. The militia captain's face flushed with anger. We don't recognize your jurisdiction in this matter, Deputy. The territory's internal affairs are not subject to federal interference. Murder of a federal marshal is absolutely a federal matter. Johnson's hand rested casually near his sidearm, as is corruption involving federal land grants and Indian treaties. Stand down, Captain, before you add obstruction of justice to the territory's growing list of crimes. The standoff continued as the delivery wagons slipped out the back of the building, carrying newspapers to distribution points throughout Helena and beyond. Carson had planned for this contingency, establishing alternative routes to ensure the special edition would reach the public regardless of militia interference. Inside, Nathan and Margaret helped the newspaper staff secure the original documents, preparing for the possibility that they might need to abandon the building. Carson worked furiously at his desk, finalizing telegrams to his contacts at Eastern newspapers, ensuring that digital copies of the most damning evidence would reach Washington, New York, and Chicago, regardless of what happened in Helena. The confrontation outside escalated as more militia members arrived, reinforcing the captain's position. Deputy Johnson found himself increasingly outnumbered, though he maintained his stance in the doorway, a living embodiment of federal authority standing against territorial corruption. Last warning, Deputy. The captain's patience was clearly wearing thin. Step aside or we'll remove you by force. The tension shattered with the sound of a gunshot from farther down the street, not aimed at the standoff, but a signal that drew everyone's attention to a new development. Riders approached from the direction of the territorial capital. Not militia, but a mixed group of citizens led by Marshal Cooper himself. Cooper reined in beside the militia captain, his expression grim but determined. Captain Reynolds, by federal authority, I'm ordering you to disperse your men and return to barracks. I don't take orders from you, Cooper. The captain's hand moved toward his pistol. My authority comes directly from the territorial governor, and mine comes from the President of the United States. Cooper's response was measured but carried unmistakable authority. Moreover, I've just received a telegram from Washington. The Senate Committee on Territories has suspended Montana's statehood application pending investigation into corruption charges. The announcement rippled through both groups. Statehood had been Montana's driving ambition for years, the culmination of decades of development and political maneuvering. Its suspension represented a devastating blow to the territorial government's aspirations. That's impossible, the captain's certainty wavered visibly. The statehood vote is scheduled for next month. The arrangements have been finalized. Not anymore. Cooper produced the telegram for the captain to read. The Senate has concerns about admitting a territory whose government may be compromised by systemic corruption. They've dispatched a special committee to investigate before proceeding with the statehood vote. The citizens who had accompanied Cooper began distributing copies of Carson's special edition, which had already reached the streets despite the militia's efforts to contain it. The captain found himself facing not just federal authority, but the rapidly spreading truth as his own men accepted and read the damning headlines. This is sedition. The captain made one final attempt to assert control. These allegations are unproven slander against the territory's founding families. These allegations are supported by photographic evidence, financial records, and sworn testimonies. Cooper countered, all of which are now in federal hands and beyond your reach. The militia's resolve crumbled as the reality of their situation became clear. They were outnumbered not just by Cooper's expanded federal presence, but by the growing crowd of citizens drawn by the commotion and the explosive headlines of the special edition. The territorial government's authority, maintained for decades through intimidation and secrecy, was evaporating in the face of exposed truth. The captain ordered his men to stand down, retreating from the newspaper office with as much dignity as he could muster. The crowd's murmurs grew as more citizens read the newspaper's revelations, shock and anger spreading through Helena as the extent of the corruption became clear. Inside the newspaper office, Nathan, Margaret, and Carson watched the militia's withdrawal with cautious relief. The immediate threat had passed, but the larger battle was just beginning. The territorial government wouldn't surrender its power without a fight, regardless of federal intervention or public opinion. The special committee from Washington will arrive within the week, Cooper informed them as he entered the building. Senator Wilkinson is leading the investigation personally. He's known for his anti-corruption stance and has no ties to Montana's power structure. Will it be enough? Margaret's question cut to the heart of their concern. These families have been controlling Montana for decades. They have connections in Washington, too. It's different now. Nathan's journalistic instincts recognized the shifting landscape. Before, they operated in darkness, their crimes hidden behind closed doors and buried secrets. Now it's all exposed to public scrutiny. That changes everything. Carson nodded agreement as he surveyed the continuing work of his newspaper staff. The power of the press isn't in what we print, it's in what people do with the information once they have it. Look outside. Through the windows, they could see the crowd growing in the street, citizens gathering in groups to discuss the revelations in the special edition. Anger was visible on many faces, the sense of betrayal palpable as people learned how their territory had been built on theft and murder, their government compromised by corruption at every level. This is how change begins, Carson's voice carried the weight of a man who'd spent his career waiting for this moment. Not with laws or committees, but with ordinary people demanding better from those who govern them. The following days brought a whirlwind of developments as the story spread beyond Montana's borders. Eastern newspapers picked up Carson's expose, expanding on it with their own investigations into the connections between Montana's founding families and powerful interests in Washington, New York, and Chicago. The corruption that had seemed so firmly entrenched began to unravel as outside scrutiny intensified. Senator Wilkinson's special committee arrived in Helena amid unprecedented public interest. Their initial hearings were held in the territorial capitol building itself, a symbolic reclaiming of government institutions from corrupt influences. Nathan and Margaret were among the first witnesses called to testify, providing first-hand accounts of their discoveries and the attempts to silence them. Victor Blackwood, faced with overwhelming evidence and abandoned by his former allies, negotiated a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against higher-ranking members of the conspiracy. His detailed account of how the machine operated, naming territorial officials and business leaders who had participated in decades of corruption, provided the committee with a roadmap for their expanding investigation. The territorial governor resigned in disgrace when documents from Edmund's final cache revealed his direct involvement in fraudulent land deals with railroad companies. The lieutenant governor who replaced him immediately pledged cooperation with the federal investigation, recognizing that Montana's path to statehood now depended on demonstrating a clean break with its corrupt past. For Margaret Winters, the public exposure of James Miller's murder brought a measure of the justice she'd sought for 10 years. A proper investigation was finally conducted, leading to the exhumation of his remains from the unmarked grave where Victor had buried him. James was reinterred in the town cemetery with full honors, his death recognized as the sacrifice of an honest man who had stood against entrenched corruption. As summer turned to autumn, Nathan found himself increasingly drawn into the work of rebuilding Montana's institutions. His background in investigative journalism made him valuable to Senator Wilkinson's committee as they drafted new transparency requirements for territorial governance. The committee's recommendations would eventually form the foundation of Montana's state constitution, ensuring that the abuses of the past could not easily be repeated. Through it all, Nathan and Margaret continued working together, their shared experience creating a bond that deepened with each passing day. The boarding house became an unofficial headquarters for citizens seeking to contribute to the territory's reformation, with Margaret providing both practical support and moral guidance to those navigating the challenging transition. The sealed room in Edmund Blackwood's store was preserved as evidence until the federal investigation concluded. Afterward, Nathan made a decision that would shape the rest of his life in Montana Territory. Using the modest savings he'd accumulated from his work with the Senate committee, he renovated the old general store, transforming it into something Edmund Blackwood might have approved. The grand reopening in October drew a substantial crowd from the surrounding area. The building that had once housed Montana's darkest secrets now stood as a symbol of transparency and public service. The front section returned to its original purpose as a general store, providing necessary goods to the community. But the back room, where the sealed door had guarded its secrets for 15 years, was transformed into a reading room housing territorial records and legal documents, freely accessible to any citizen. Nathan stood at the entrance, watching as people explored the transformed space. The weight of the past few months had changed him, the cynicism that had driven him from Chicago replaced by a cautious optimism about the possibility of reform. Montana Territory was healing, slowly but perceptibly, as honest governance replaced the corrupt systems that had dominated for so long. Margaret appeared beside him, her silver hair catching the autumn sunlight streaming through the newly cleaned windows. Edmund would be proud. Her voice carried quiet satisfaction as she surveyed the busy reading room. His insurance policy finally served its true purpose. Not just insurance, Nathan had come to understand Edmund's complex motivations through the documents they'd recovered. Redemption. He spent decades enabling corruption, but in the end, he created the means for its destruction, a final act of conscience. Like the territory itself, Margaret observed, built on theft and fraud, but now with a chance to remake itself into something better. As they spoke, a messenger arrived with a telegram from Washington. Nathan read it quickly, then passed it to Margaret, a smile spreading across his face. The Senate has rescheduled Montana's statehood vote for January. Senator Wilkinson believes it will pass easily now that the reforms are in place. The news spread through the gathering, generating spontaneous celebration. Statehood had been Montana's dream for years, delayed but not denied by the necessary reckoning with its corrupt foundations. Now that dream would be realized on more solid ground, with institutions designed to prevent the abuses of the past. As evening approached, Nathan and Margaret stood on the porch of the converted store, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed Montana's troubled growth and nascent redemption. The territorial flag still flew above the building, soon to be replaced by the banner of America's newest state. What will you do when statehood comes? Margaret's question held more than casual interest. Nathan considered his options, paths that would have seemed impossible months earlier when he'd arrived as a desperate man seeking any opportunity to rebuild his life. Carson has offered me a position at the newspaper, a chance to continue the work we've started, ensuring transparency in the new state government. A watchdog, Margaret nodded approval. Every government needs one, even the most honest. And you? Nathan turned the question back to her. The boarding house has become a community center under your guidance. Will that continue? For now, Margaret's expression softened as she gazed toward the cemetery where James Miller now rested properly honored. But perhaps it's time for new beginnings all around. James would want that, I think. The statement hung in the air between them, filled with possibility. They had begun as reluctant allies in a dangerous quest for truth, become partners in the fight against corruption, and now stood on the threshold of something more personal, if they chose to pursue it. Behind them, the reading room bustled with activity as citizens examined territorial records, educated themselves about their rights, and participated in the governance that had been denied them for too long. The sealed door that had once hidden Montana's darkest secrets now stood permanently open, a reminder that truth, however painful, was the only foundation upon which a just society could be built. As darkness fell over the small town, Nathan placed a memorial plaque beside the entrance. The bronze tablet commemorated James Miller, whose courage had begun the process that eventually exposed Montana's corrupt foundations. Beneath his name was inscribed a simple epitaph that spoke to both his sacrifice and the territory's hard-won redemption. Some truths are worth dying for, But the greatest honor is to live in their light,